going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Mohammad Ghaedi, a visiting scholar at George Mason University and a board member of Political Psychology Committee of the Iranian Political Science Association. On behalf of the Iranian Political Science Association and also the House for Humanities Scholars, I want to welcome you out to our event today. This is part of our lecture series on political psychology. Today, Dr. Simmons will talk about the psychology of the conflict narrative. Please follow us. More people are joining us and we'll get started soon. I want to mention that Zoom restricted its services in Iran due to sanctions. Therefore, we are on a Sky Room, and today my guests and I are learning about this platform. I have a question for the audience. Please go to chat and type where you are watching us from. This helps us better plan future events. You can follow us and get the latest updates about our future events on platforms such as Eventbrite and Telegram. The links will be available in chat. Now I'm going to switch to Farsi and introduce our today's speaker. سلام به همه مخاطبین عزیز. از طرف کمیته روانشناسی سیاسی انجمن علوم سیاسی ایران و خانه اندیشمندان علوم انسانی به سخنران محترم آقای دکتر سولن سیمنز و مخاطبین محترم خوش آمد میگم. این پنجمین سخنرانی از مجموع سخنرانی‌های کمیته روانشناسی سیاسی انجمن علوم سیاسی ایران است. در اولین سخنرانی با عنوان روانشناسی سیاسی نیازها و ضرورت‌های ایران 1400 بنده و آقای دکتر علی اشرف نظری تلاش کردیم بحث مقدماتی در حوزه‌های معرفت شناسی، روش شناسی، اهمیت و کاربردهای عملی روانشناسی سیاسی رو طرح کنیم و با نشان دادن تصویر بزرگتر فضا رو برای سخنرانی‌های بعدی آماده کنیم. در سخنرانی دوم دکتر دانیل راتبارت در مورد احساسات و رشد گروه‌های افراطی سیاسی صحبت کرد. در سخنرانی سوم خانم مارتا کاتم در مورد نظریه تصویر یا ایماژ در روانشناسی شناختی و روانشناسی سیاسی سخنرانی کرد. سخنران بعدی آقای دکتر چارلز ولر در مورد اهمیت تاریخ و ارتباطش با روانشناسی سیاسی صحبت کرد. در این سخنرانی در مورد روایت و روانشناسی سیاسی بیشتر یاد خواهیم گرفت. روایت یکی از حوزه‌هایی که به خصوص با رشد شبکه‌های اجتماعی هم در سیاست و هم در علوم اجتماعی بسیار مورد توجه قرار گرفته و مطالعاتش هم رو به رشده. به دلیل اهمیت اون در سخنرانی‌های آینده خانم دکتر سارا کاب باز هم در مورد روایت و روانشناسی سیاسی صحبت خواهند کرد. پیشنهاد میکنم سخنرانی ایشون رو که در حال برنامه‌ریزی برای 2 ماه آینده است از دست ندید. ایشون ادیتور ژورنال روایت و مناقشه است و یکی از اساتیدی است که بیش از همه پژوهشگران در حوزه روایت و مناقشه به مقالات و کتابهاش ارجاع شده. در آینده همچنین در موضوعات دیگر روانشناسی سیاسی مثل روانشناسی رهبران سخنرانانی دعوت خواهیم کرد. ما امیدوارم بتونیم از سخنرانی اساتید ایرانی هم که در حوزه روانشناسی سیاسی تالیف کردن بهره مند بشیم. روانشناسی سیاسی ظرفیت زیادی برای شکوفایی در ایران داره. و امیدوارم با کمک اساتید و پژوهشگرانی که در این زمینه تدریس و تألیف و ترجمه داشتند و شما این میان رشته کاربردی و بسیار مهم را شکوفاتر کنیم. جهت یادآوری عنوان کنم که کانال روانشناسی سیاسی رو در تلگرام ایجاد کردیم که در اونجا اطلاعات برنامه‌ها رو قرار خواهیم داد. لینک کانال تلگرام و صفحه ایونت برایت ما در بخش چت قرار داده شده. علاوه بر اون لطفاً به بخش چت برید و برامون بنویسید که از کجا این برنامه رو تماشا میکنید. این به ما کمک میکنه در برنامه‌ریزی روز و ساعات جلسات بعدیمون. اجازه بدید که به سراغ معرفی سخنران امروز برم. آقای دکتر سالن سیمونز دکترای جامعه شناسی و پژوهشگر و دانشیار دانشگاه جورج میسن با تخصص تحلیل و حل مناقشه است. از ایشون به تازگی کتابی با این عنوان منتشر شده: نظریه روایت ریشه‌ای و حل مناقشه، قدرت، عدالت و ارزش‌ها. این نظریه ابزاری رو در اختیار محققان و سیاستگزاران میگذاره که مبتنی بر رویکردهای پیشرو در خصوص روایت و مناقشه است. این نظریه برای فهم مبانی اخلاقی و فکری اختلاف نظرهای ریشه‌ای میان گروه‌ها مفیده و میتونه به طرفین برای درک عمیق‌تر همدیگه کمک کنه. دکتر سیمونز همچنین نویسنده کتاب کسوف برابریه که انتشارات دانشگاه استنفورد در سال 2013 منتشر کرد. ایشون کتاب دیگه‌ای با عنوان اساتید دانشگاه و سیاست اونها با آقای دکتر نیل گروس کار کرده که توسط دانشگاه جان هاپکینز در سال 2014 منتشر شده. کار فعلی او در مورد صلح و حل تعارض نظریه نهادی وبری رو با فلسفه اجتماعی انتقادی ترکیب میکنه و با بهره‌گیری از نمادشناسی و تحلیل روایت میکوشه طرفهای درگیر در مناقشه درک عمیق‌تر از ایدئولوژی و ایده‌های همدیگه داشته باشند. دکتر سیمونز در سال 2013 به عنوان رئیس موقت مدرسه مطالعات صلح و از سال 2014 تا 2017 معاون استراتژی جهانی دانشگاه جورج میسن بوده. در حوزه تدریس ایشون کلاس‌هایی رو در زمینه روایت، تئوری‌های مناقشه، رسانه، گفتمان و مناقشه، حقوق بشر، تعارضات بین‌المللی، نظریه انتقادی و روش‌شناسی کیفی و کمی تدریس میکنه. اگر سوالی دارید لطفاً در بخش چت بنویسید که در پایان سخنرانی از ایشون پرسیده بشه. من به زبان انگلیسی برای معرفی سخنران برمیگردم و بعد از ایشون دعوت میکنم سخنرانیشون رو شروع کنم. Now I'm switching back to English. It's my pleasure to introduce our today's guest. Dr. Solon Simmons is an associate professor of conflict analysis and resolution at George Mason University, with a PhD in sociology and the author of the recent book, Root Narrative Theory and Conflict Resolution, Power, Justice, and Values, which provides researchers and practitioners a tool grounded in cutting-edge approaches to narrative and conflict. Root narrative theory is useful for capturing the moral and intellectual basis of radical disagreement, fostering a sense of radical curiosity and helping parties to pursue deeper mutual understandings. He is also the author of The Eclipse of Equality, Arguing America on Meet the Press. Stanford University published this book in 2013. And Professors and Their Politics with Neil Gross, John Hopkins University Press published this book in 2014. His current work on peace and conflict resolution combines Weberian institutional theory with critical social philosophy, bringing in insight from semiotics and narrative analysis with the goal of developing a deeper understanding of the ideas and ideologies of rivals in conflict. Solon served as interim dean for the Carter School in 2013 and vice president for global strategy for George Mason from 2014 to 2017. He teaches classes on conflict theory, narrative, media, discourse and conflict, human rights, quantitative and qualitative methodologies, global conflict, and critical theory. Dr. Simmons, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back with questions from our audience in a few minutes.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Dr. Ghaedi, and also for arranging this global experience. It's a great honor to be here, and I look forward to engaging with our audience. As I begin, I'm going to be speaking today about the concept of peace and justice and the relationship, their psychological relationship as it's joined in narrative. As I begin, I'd like to post in the chat, just in case, a link that is to a quantitative instrument, a kind of personality test, if you like, which has been developed primarily for use, only tested in the United States, but are interested in its global reach. So if anyone speaks English and has an interest in learning about where they fit in the root narrative profile I'll describe today, it can be fun to take these sorts of tests. Let me move forward with the presentation. We're going to be speaking today about stories, but about narrative structure. Narrative has become a very exciting topic recently, in particular with the rise of a certain kind of global competition that began with the presidency of Donald Trump in the United States, in which storytelling became, in a way, more important for policymaking and governance than the traditional rational arguments. What I want to argue is that there's not a distinction between a rational argument, a policy argument, and a story inherently, that these are related concepts, but when we engage in policy debate, in deliberation, we tend to, if you will, bracket and take values and take them out of the conversation, which takes us out of the storytelling space. One reason why we might be in a narrative moment is because we're now debating global politics in a way that hasn't been done since the Second World War. You might think of this as a return to multipolarity, in which the United States is an important, but only one player in a more diverse international community. Therefore, ideas and therefore stories will become important. In this slide, I have reference to a lot of text from a famous philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, in which he describes what's called a scientific paradigm. This is the rational side of an argument. And this would be true not only in physics, which is what he's describing, but in international relations and international affairs. Any theory of how to engage in international politics we might have is itself based on assumptions, a model that is limited in some ways and then limits what we can actually see. On the right of the slide, you see a famous psychological experiment from the 1890s. This is in the original German. But when you look at this, this is part of a class of visual illusions. When you look at it, you see either a duck or a rabbit. And when you see one, it's hard to see the other at the same time. This class of visual illusions is a helpful metaphor for thinking about narrative, because the stories we bring to politics are very much like this duck-rabbit duality. In a sense, we see the world only as fitting one story or another story. It's difficult to see them both at the same time. And when people are in conflict, especially very protracted and intense conflict, one party tends to be seeing the situation they're engaged in as a duck, and the other sees it as a rabbit. Fitting in some ways to be having a conversation between Iran and the United States, because the conflict has been so deep between those two countries for so long. The theory would suggest that the Americans are seeing a duck and the Iranians are seeing a rabbit. Not that either is inherently wrong, but that the world they're looking at appears different to each. So this is the premise of a narrative approach to thinking about politics. It's a simple metaphor, but I think you'll see it's very helpful. What we're learning about narrative, and this is true of many aspects of moral reasoning as well, is that the distinction between rationality and emotion is not tenable. It doesn't hold for our biology. We make rational decisions using our emotions. Emotions are very helpful for our rational decision making. In fact, it's how we think quickly and make decisions rapidly. So what we have here is we have a simple model where we take an action based on some theory to produce an outcome. And that's mainly what we would describe as the space of most policy debate. It's debate about deliberation of means toward a given end. But we also have values that would link outcomes to deeper feelings. And in a sense, we can think of that material inside this diagram as the left brain, the rational part of our thinking, and the creative, artistic side of our thinking brought together in narrative. Not only that, but this neocortex at the top of our mammalian brain is linked to the brain stem, to our limbic system, to the amygdala, and to those quick reactions. Narrative brings together all of that apparatus in one, the left and right brain, the amygdala and the neocortex, and integrates them in a very quick way of making assessments. And that's how we see either the duck or the rabbit. So narrative is popular today, I think, in part, not simply as a fad or the latest thing people are discussing in international politics and security studies, but because it brings together a number of these things we know about rational choice, social identity, and symbolism, and so on. So I think that's the reason why narrative has become important and is not merely the next fad. Here's a famous, the founder, Johan Galtung of peace studies, and he's recently in a tweet criticized the field as a whole of peace studies as being only corpse counting, meaning counting how many people die in war. And what he's trying to hint at is this point about studying peace is more than just studying war. We're not interested only in stopping the killing, but we're interested in building deeper relations between people. And this gets to my main concern, one of the main concerns of my current work, which is why, if peace is so attractive, why is it so hard to attain? Why is it so hard to get people to focus on peace when they want it so dearly? And Johan Galtung helps us to see that even the scientists, we ourselves are caught in our own narratives of conflict and are limited in that way. Here's another, this is from John Paul Lederach, another famous peace scholar, a younger one than Johan Galtung. And this comes out of his work from Nicaragua. And it comes, now this is a Christian thinker, so he's using, again, narrative to make sense of an objective phenomenon. He's using it rationally. But he used this old psalm, this old song from the Hebrew tradition, that went as follows in this translation: mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. So this seemed to be important to the peacemakers in Nicaragua at the time. And he wanted to learn from them, from their indigenous practices of trying to build peace. So what is it? What would it mean to have peace? Very actually complicated question to answer. What is peace? And we know, and this is what's interesting about this particular psalm, is that in order to have peace, you have to have justice. Because if you don't right what was wrong, it's very difficult to forgive and to move forward. And always there's something that is wrong. Always someone has done something that needs accountability. And so this distinction between truth-telling and justice on one side and mercy or forgiveness and peace on the other was what he saw as a synthesis. I'll call it conflict transformation. He called it reconciliation. But what's interesting about it from my point of view is it talks about two different types of stories. A struggle story with an adversary, someone that you have to defeat, and a journey story, which we're in together, which we're moving toward a common outcome. Think of a shipwreck. Even if you hate the other person on the shipwreck, if you're on the lifeboat together, it's important to row in the same direction rather than fighting and killing one another. So this is an interesting distinction, important in peace building, where we see these two kinds of stories coming together. I'm going to just walk through a set of questions. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is a flow chart from the book I'm working on now that tries to identify what are the conditions of the story that we'd be describing that would allow us to determine if we're in more of a collaborative journey story or an adversarial struggle story. The first is the most important, which is what I'll call the intention condition. And that is, so we identify with someone. We always think one person is the good guy, one is the bad guy, or one is person we hope will come out well in the story, and one we hope maybe won't. And there's a beginning to the story, a middle to the story, and an end to the story. Protagonist, antagonist, and there's a problem they're trying to deal with or solve. The first question is, did the antagonist, the villain, intend to cause the protagonist problem? And if yes, then you have a hero and villain story. There's a struggle. If no, then maybe you're in a collaborative journey story. But it's more complicated than that. Because even if the person didn't intend to cause you harm, if they benefit from your harm, if it's good for them to ignore the things that have happened to you, then you're back into a kind of a struggle. And so the stories we tell can vary in these ways. We can vary the intentions of the antagonist, and we can also talk about the structures that are empowering the antagonist. In a global context, perhaps, maybe you'd be interested in, even if someone in the international community was not interested in causing trouble in developmental problems in the global south, maybe they benefit economically from the inequality, and still, therefore, there's a bit of a struggle there. So that would be a kind of a story someone would tell about international economic development that puts the global north, puts the United States and Europe in a negative light. But even if we move forward and we argue that yes, we're in a struggle, there's this question we have, which is, okay, we have some people who are benefiting and we need to struggle with them, but could they ever be convinced to help us solve the problem? Are they what I'd call corrigible, or are they incorrigible? That is, are they lost? Are they evil? Is there nothing to be done with them? Can they not be reformed? If they can be reformed, we're back over in the collaborative journey type story. And if they can't be reformed, there's really nothing to do but fight. Okay, which is unfortunate, but that's the kind of analysis that would bring these different conditions together. And that's when this is moving us into what I'd call a justice direction. Whereas the peace story, as you notice, which is what we see in the collaborative journey, the peace story is somewhat boring. There's no one to fight. There's no injustice. There's nothing. It's a shame, but there's no one to fight. And so we tend to be drawn psychologically more toward this adversarial struggle story. There's one more question, which I'll call, because if you love peace and you're interested in conflict resolution, even if you have to defeat the antagonist, maybe still, once you win, you can bring them back into your solution. That would be about the well-being of the antagonist being important to you. Think of a marriage, a bad marriage. Things have gone bad. She wants to hurt me. He wants to hurt me. There's nothing we can do. But do you care about the well-being of that person at the end? In the end, that would put you back over into more of a peace story, into a collaborative journey story versus a struggle story with an evil adversary. And then finally, I bring all of this together and we can see the big archetypal plots, the different types of story plots you might tell that are, they have a happy ending or a sad ending. Either there's a comic journey or a tragic journey. That is, even though you might care about your maybe someone's going through a divorce, they try to work with the other person and it doesn't turn out badly, even though they still love them. It's a tragic story, but everyone is unhappy. Or maybe there's a comic outcome. Maybe they get back together. And this can apply to nations as well as to marriages. Or if there's a struggle, we either defeat the bad guy, we stand up and we win against the evil empire, or we lose and we're in what I call a satirical struggle, and we tell a story to fight another day, and eventually justice will come to us. Okay, so this is what I call the peace is boring, justice is not framework. What I mean by it is that these peace stories, these tragic and comic journeys, are harder to anchor in our psychology because they don't have the dramatic tension inherent in them to drive a story forward. And so even very subtle thinkers will find themselves losing out in the media competition, either on television where someone changes the channel, on the internet when someone swipes to the next thing. And what will predominate in the ecology of storytelling is these justice and struggle stories, which are powerful because they speak about injustice and what needs to be done, and yet they don't allow for a richer and subtle approach to alternative futures. If you are familiar with conflict resolution literature, they don't allow for win-win outcomes as likely as they do put us in a win-lose situation, or perhaps even to live or die situation in very terrible circumstances. So it's important to understand the psychology of telling stories, and that's what this flowchart is for, to think about how we could tell stories, not only about marriages, but about international relations, that allowed us to steer the story, to steer the plot more toward the tragic and comic outcomes, the plot structures that would allow for conflict resolution. That being said, I think we need to understand that justice stories are the primary mode of political storytelling. Injustice and justice stories, and they need to be complicated and rounded off to allow us to think about more subtle patterns of relation. Here is a quote from a famous English novelist who was giving a lecture about the novel itself, about storytelling. It's a very important distinction. I'll actually read it for you. And he says this: one great advantage of flat characters, this is a concept, flat characters, is that they are easily recognized wherever they come in to the story. It is a convenience for an author when he can strike with his full force at once, and flat characters are very useful to him, since they never need reintroducing, never run away, have not to be watched for development. What he means by this is that the characters in our stories, if we're going to be effective politically, if we want to introduce very simple mass mobilizing force, if you want to write a movie that's going to sell, or if you want to run a political movement that's going to very quickly energize the people to fight, you need flat characters as opposed to round characters. And round characters are those characters, let me just go back a slide. Round characters are those characters who tend to fill out the tragic and what I'll call comic journeys. But I don't mean funny. What I mean is something like, if you know the Italian author Dante Alighieri, the idea of a divine comedy, of going through a complex process and coming out with a happy ending, okay? So those characters are much rounder, more complex, surprising. We can't anticipate everything they will do. Sometimes they're just like us, and us when we're good, but also us when we're bad. And so those characters are more interesting, but they're not as useful. They're not as useful politically, and they're not as useful in Hollywood, usually. So what we have instead are the flat characters. So the flat character is our entry point into understanding political ideology, okay? And that's where I want to take the rest of the talk, and what root narrative theory helps you to do, just to keep track of where I'm moving and why root narrative theory might be interesting. And the quiz that I shared in the chat is about measuring character types within root narrative. So the powerful thing about root narrative theory, I have here a representation of DNA. You know the story about in international espionage, how you can take a coffee cup someone is drinking, you can swab it, and you can then get their DNA. You know, we understand these kinds of spy stories. It's true, you can do this. I'm going to argue that root narrative theory, the book that I wrote through this structure that I've discovered, is very much like this. That is, you can take a political speech, you can go sentence by sentence and sometimes clause by clause, and you can code it with root narrative theory, and you can discover what it is, what the root narrative profile of that author in that speech is presenting. And therefore, whether they know it or not, what their political values and ideology happen to be. So most people know these things about themselves, but there is a kind of a magical feature that this kind of theory can, this kind of technique can produce for us, which is quite revealing. I won't go too deep into all this. This is a sociologist named Max Weber, a German sociologist from the last century. very famous founder of sociology, one of the most important founders. The root narrative theory that I develop in my book builds on his distinction between class, status, and party. These are three forms of power. They are, he developed them in an essay and didn't elaborate entirely. Later sociologists have elaborated on these networks of power more. The critical insight is this, that if we want to understand morality, moral reactions to injustice, we have to understand forms of power and how power has been abused. And so what happens, what I pick up on are these, in red you see class, status, militaries, and political systems. These four forms of power are going to be the ones that are at the root of these political stories. And they're going to be, and what I'll argue is that smart people all around the world, in Iran, in China, in the United States, in South America, react to these forms of power when they're being abused, and they develop value systems to push back on them, whether they're secular ideologies or even anchored in deeper faith traditions and religions. Morality pushes back on the abuse of power. This is the argument. So here we have the basic story. If I were to point you to one slide of the entire talk to understand root narrative theory, it would probably be this one. And this is because it puts the heroes and the villains very clearly against one another. There are four root narratives, each corresponding to the network of power that is being abused in the story. And each one has a specific villain that they target that does damage to a specific hero. Well, does damage to something that the hero cares about, put it that way. In the first, these are U.S. focused, so I apologize for that, but they're very resonant in the United States. The first is 9/11. I assume everyone remembers that in 2001. And the story that people tell there, and George W. Bush, that president, if you remember him, very famously told a story in which foreign terrorists, dangerous enemies, are trying to kill us. This is the story. And I, the president, as the commander-in-chief of the state, will protect you, the innocent citizen. So that's a very powerful story. Every culture has its own version. There's, we, the legitimate representatives of the state, will protect the citizens from our dangerous enemies. It's perhaps the most powerful political story that you can tell, and it tends to drive out the others because a root of this one is fear of violent death at the hands of your enemies, and no one likes that, right? But it's important to understand it's a story. It involves a villain, and remember my point, who's incorrigible, who can't come along, and who has to be defeated. And so therefore the military, the military apparatus of the state will go and defeat those enemies. But that's only one story. There's also another kind of story, which is about, ironically, when the king comes to protect you from the dangerous enemy, the king has so much power that he can become a bad king. This is Henry VIII, the King of England, who's famous for having so many wives and being a terrible tyrant. But when you have a bad king, you need to be able to push back on the bad king. How do you push back? You push back with rule of law, with a constitution, perhaps, with a set of written down rules. These law codes go back to Hammurabi, the idea that the king can't just do whatever he wants, but has to be constrained. The bad king story is one that produces a kind of a hero, which is the law itself, or lawyers, civil rights activists, people who push back on authoritarianism. The human rights discourse is anchored here. And the American Revolution saw itself through this particular lens. So when many American people are speaking about what they deeply believe in the individual and the rule of law, it's this kind of story they are channeling. This is the rabbit that they're seeing the world through, and many other people are seeing a duck. Okay, so that's important to know because it helps to explain why people actually are committed in a deep moral sense to some of these policy perspectives that might seem irrational from another point of view. The third story is what I call the selfish elite story, and here you have a famous cartoon from the development of American capitalism, and I believe this is in the 1870s, a period when modern multinational corporations were developing, Of course, they were developing in your part of the world as well, driven from the same centers. And all of the money was flowing from those peripheries to the center. And so this kind of story is one in which the people who manage those centralized economic institutions are selfish. They think only about themselves and not the well-being of all the people. So this is about the few against the many. And this is a story, the villain is the capitalist, perhaps, the rich person. Every culture and every part of history has this story. This is not a unique story to our time. And it's a very powerful one about wealthy people treating the normal people, the sort of average people, badly. And what you need to fight back on that is a people's movement. You need a revolution, perhaps, or maybe you just need a union movement, or maybe you just need certain kinds of regulations which would constrain certain bad behaviors and so on. But there are various policies that are consistent with this type of a root narrative. And the last form is one that's quite important today, perhaps the most important that we're dealing with in some sense, which is about prejudice, bias, racism, ethnocentrism, ultimately cultural difference. So that is, this is from the American Civil Rights Movement. This is about white people and black people, but it could be between, this is the kind of story you see in Israel today, in which Israelis, Jewish people, are accused of being biased against Arabs, especially against Muslims, but Arabs in general. And so that conflict, ironically, because of course the Jewish people were the ones who were the target of this discrimination by the German Christians, but at the same time are now involved in a different relationship with another group of people within Israel. And so you see that this pattern of difference, of cultural difference, leads to differences in status, one being high, one being low, and that being allowing for abuse of power, but it's a cultural power. It's about respect, respect for who you are, for your identity. So these four root narratives then are all distinct. They all have very different philosophical anchors. They're different philosophical leading political philosophers who argue in favor of each one. And each one serves as either a duck or a rabbit, to use my metaphor. That is, when you see the world through one of them, it's very hard to see the other. And when you're in an active, violent confrontation with the other, who, if you're a duck person and you're fighting a rabbit person, it's very difficult to forgive that other person because they seem immoral in a fundamental way. And I think that's built into the psychology of the narrative. Here I have the same picture, but I've just put the villain, the victims, the people who are suffering, not the hero. That is civilians, rational citizens, the virtuous people, the undaunted outgroup, and the value that comes with each. And so one of the things that's distinctive about my approach is I have two new words. And in scholarship, we often can't contribute much. So if you can contribute a word, that would be a lot. And I haven't contributed this yet, but maybe I can interest you. The two new words, so there are two old words, which are libertarian and egalitarian. Those are for the values of liberty and equality. But the two new words are securitarian and dignitarian. By securitarian, I mean it's what people would often call authoritarian. But what I mean by securitarian is that you value the security of the population and the territory. And it's a good thing. You don't want violent people to come in and kill all of your people and do terrible things. That's not a good thing. So what you want is you want someone who can protect the security of the people and the territory. But that can be abused. So that's securitarian. No one wants authority for authority's sake. They want well, some do, but bad people do. A good person wants authority for security, to protect the people, okay? Protect the state, to protect the territory. Dignitarian is the other word. And dignitarian means that you're protecting the dignity of the group, the dignity of the human beings who are every bit as respectable as anyone else. So in the United States, maybe it's black people and white people. In other parts of the world, it's in China, for example, there's a challenge with managing the Uyghur as a different ethnic group and the status abuses that could come there potentially with the Han Chinese versus others. And every country has their own tensions of this kind. But that's what I'd call a dignitarian politics, a dignitarian imagination, one which anchors on, respects the dignity of those people who are minoritized, who are put in the minority, and who can't defend themselves against the larger or more powerful status group of the in-group. Okay, so those are the four. I don't have time to go deep into this, and this is something I discuss in the book, but if you think of those, just let me go back for a second, each one has a different color. So that's the metaphor would be the color now. So if you think of blending the colors in like a color wheel here, you see that when you blend the colors, they produce subtle variations. So purple comes from red and blue. So too, when you take one of these root narratives and blend it with another, you produce a subtle variation. Okay. So what I do in the book, using this structural theory from the Lithuanian theorist Grimas, Algirdis Grimas, which is a little bit of a complicated technicality that I can't get into now. What I do is I produce a new set of not just 4 root narratives, but 12. And those are the ones that I use in the quiz. So if you're able to take that quiz, you'll find yourself classified along these 12 root narratives. The 12 root narratives come from this technique, and I'll just briefly show you. Here's the basic idea that the grammar, if you will, of the sentence is the abuses of the antagonist function must be overcome by the protagonist function. Okay, so there are good people and bad people, and the story is such that the good people have to win, or else we're very unhappy. So what you do is you just take the villain, or what I call the antagonist function, of one of the basic narratives. The defense narrative is, say, the 9/11 narrative, or I'm sure everyone has their own version of the state protecting the people against the dangerous enemy. And you borrow that villain, and you borrow it from another one of the root narratives. So in this case, the blue villain is going to be blended with the yellow hero. Okay, that's the basic idea. What it does is this: you get the blue villain and the yellow hero, and it produces a new color, a new story. Okay, so this story then becomes what I call the unity story, where we're going to protect innocent civilians from internal discord against partisans, internal partisans, people who are effectively traitors to our own country because they're selfish. They're partisan. They're only interested in their own well-being, but they're trying to take over the state to do that, and we need to have national unity. Okay, so it's a little bit different. National unity is different than protecting us versus the foreigner, protecting against our own. You can do that with each one of these. You just take the villain of one and you blend it with the hero of the other in the narratives. Here, I just present the 4 different areas, the 4 colors, each one inflected by the other villain, and you see the 12 root narratives, and you see the logic of them. So, for example, undaunted outgroups are disrespected by the bad king, and undaunted outgroups are disrespected by the selfish elites, and so on. And it produces a different logic and a different story. I want to just end here with some applications. This is not from the quantitative instrument that I've shared with you, but it's from a specific case that I've done an analysis on, which is the country of Eritrea. If you know, this is in the Horn of Africa, often described as the North Korea of Africa by American policymakers. So this is one of the, I'm sorry to say, since I'm speaking in Iran, but the countries the United States has most and worst relations with, Iran is obviously one, North Korea is another, Eritrea is in that league. So this is a very deep conflict. And the American leadership cadre really doesn't like the Eritrean government. So what I was interested in doing is saying, well, what could it be that there's a root narrative difference? That is, one sees the world as a rabbit, one sees the world as a duck. So what I've done is I've taken the speeches of Isaias Afwerki, the president of Eritrea, and I've taken the main critic of him and his regime, which is Human Rights Watch. If you know this international organization, Human Rights Watch produces reports of various countries and their human rights abuses each year. And Eritrea is one of the places that it's a starring player in this. So I just wanted to see what kind of story is Eritrea telling about itself? What kind of story is Human Rights Watch telling about Eritrea? And what you see here is quite striking. So on the left side, you see that Isaias Afwerki, when he speaks about Eritrea, always speaks in terms of that he on the left side, he rarely uses what I'll call a human rights discourse. He doesn't see the world as a rabbit the way Human Rights Watch does. He doesn't see the world as about his powerful government, his strong, powerful government abusing the Eritrean people. Instead, we look at the right on the right chart. He sees that the Eritrean people are being abused by the world, the international community, as if they were a racial group. The nation of Eritrea is almost like Black people, African American people in the United States. That is, the international community dominated by the United States is disrespecting the Eritrean people and their right to sovereignty. So he sees the world in terms of a liberation struggle, which Human Rights Watch almost never does. That is using this DNA sample as I described, of their actual report. You see almost none of that liberation narrative. And in Isaiah's speeches, you almost never see the human rights perspective, the story of a libertarian story, but Human Rights Watch is dominated by that. So this is a perfect storm. That is, one side sees the exact same events. They're looking at the same events in radically different ways. One sees it as a rabbit, one sees it as a duck, right? And it leads to terrible confusions and a lot of difficulty. And I suspect that if we were to look at relations between we've done this with North and South Korea, quite different, and any other really protracted, terrible conflict, you'll probably see some kind of root narrative divide like this. Now, just to show that we can do this everywhere, I've done it to the United States and looked at the Republican Party platforms, that is, the manifestos they put forward about what they're going to do when they govern, going back to 1920. So 100 years of new Republican leaders from President Harding in 1920 through Hoover, Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, H.W. Bush, W. Bush, and then Trump. So what you see here is the four categories. Remember, I told you the four categories, the root narratives. And what you see is that there's some consistency and mainly a lot of focus on security and some variation. So maybe Donald Trump wasn't so different. But it turns out there is some difference. So here's when you do a deviation from the overall total. You see Herbert Hoover, the very libertarian Republican president, was very different on human rights. And Trump is not interested in human rights in the same way in his platform. But what's really distinctive about Donald Trump, and this is where the DNA sample shows through, you may have noticed Donald Trump was different than other American presidents. I don't know if that's the story in Iran, but it certainly seems so here. He tells that 9/11 type story much more than anyone else. Look at George W. Bush, who was not interested in the dangerous foreigner. But Donald Trump was very much interested in the dangerous foreigner, and he encouraged the American people to see the world in terms of us and them, and that they are coming to harm us and to harm us physically. And that's something that we have to resist. We, the protagonist in a struggle story, have to resist that. And this is where I'll end and open this for questions. But as I'm coming back to the point, peace is boring. Peace is the story where we have a more subtle understanding. One is we see, sometimes it's a duck, sometimes it's a rabbit. In Donald Trump's world, no. It's a very simple world, and they are villains, and we need to protect ourselves from those villains, and I'll be the one to do it. And you see, it's quite distinctive. Only Ronald Reagan was even close to the 12 narrative than even Ronald Reagan, and much different from the Bushes. So I'll end there and open for questions. I know there's a lot of material that I covered about the structure of peace and justice and how stories work and then how root narrative justice stories work. But I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons, for your amazing presentation. It was very informative and interesting. I really appreciate we could finally have you at the Iranian Political Science Association. And thank you so much again. So now I'm going to go ahead and have a very concise, maybe 5 minutes summary of your talk in Farsi, and then we'll open up for Q&A. خب خیلی ممنونم من از آقای دکتر سیمنز بابت سخنرانیشون. خیلی نکات جالبی رو ایشون مطرح کردن و من نمیتونم همه رو پوشش بدم و البته که نیاز دارم که برگردم به اسلاید ها. من تلاش کنم اگر بشه اول اسلاید های مشابه این رو خودم آپلود کنم. آقای اسکندری عزیز به منم کمک میکنید من اسلاید ها رو آپلود کنم که خودم بتونم عقب و جلو کنم. رو اسلاید های ایشون من ناچارم صحبت کنم. نه همین اسلاید رو من آپلود کنم برای اینکه بتونم اون بخشایی که میخوام عقب و جلو ببرم. خب نقطه کلوز رو فقط من نشون میده. میشه به من یه بار دیگه بگید کجاست این؟ خب شاید صفحه که من میبینم به شما متفاوته یه مقدار. من بستمش الان، فقط من تنها گزینه کلوز رو داشتم. آها بله بسیار عالی. خب من الان قاعدتا باید بتونم اسلاید. بله بسیار عالی. خب آقای دکتر سالن سیمونز در مورد روایت صحبت کردن و من میتونم فقط به بخش مهم صحبت ایشون بپردازم. ایشون فرمودن توی صحبتاشون که ما اساسا توی برنامه‌هایی که مرتبط با حل منازعه است توی دانشگاه‌های مختلف یک چیزی رواج پیدا کرده، اونم اینه که به جای اینکه ما به ریشه‌های مناقشه پردازیم، مخصوصا برنامه‌هایی که بیشتر مبتنی بر روش‌های کوانتیتیو هستن، بیشتر تعداد اجساد رو میشمارن. توی این مناقشه چند نفر کشته شدن و به اینکه چه کسی در واقع مقصره و کمتر به این میپردازن که ریشه های مناقشه در چیه. ایشون اومدن رو و در واقع یک الگویی اشاره کردن بهش که این الگو با کمک روایت میتونه به ریشه های اساسی مناقشه بپردازه. این الگو رو به شکل کامل اینجا ما داریم. ببینید ما از داستان یا روایت که برگرفته از ادبیات میتونیم استفاده کنیم برای توضیح مناقشات سیاسی. معمولا توی هر مناقشه‌ای همونطور که ما تو داستان‌ها داریم، ما یک آدم بد داریم و یک آدم خوب داریم، شخصیت مثبت یا شخصیت منفی. توی فیلم و شخصیت مثبت معمولا نقش اصلی رو داره و قهرمان و هیرو ماست و اون شخصیت منفی اون کسی که میخواد دنیا رو به هم بریزه و نابود کنه. ایشون از این الگو استفاده کردن برای اینکه توضیح بدن که توی مناقشه ما چجوری از همین داستان‌ها استفاده میکنیم برای توضیح مناقشه و میتونیم ازش استفاده کنیم برای حل مناقشه. گفتن که ما اگر که بخوایم در یک مناقشه نگاه کنیم میتونیم که شناسایی کنیم شخصیت مثبت و منفی رو و بعد ما میتونیم این سوال رو مطرح کنیم که توی در واقع مربعی که من روش الان کلیک دارم میکنم که آیا آنتاگونیست یا اون شخصیت منفی آیا قصد این رو داره که برای شخصیت مثبت یا قهرمان داستان مشکل ایجاد کنه؟ اگر جواب نباشه ما میتونیم سوال بعدی رو بپرسیم که آیا شخصیت منفی منافعش در اینه که شخصیت مثبت یا اون فرشته داستان رو نادیده بگیره؟ اگر جواب نباشه میتونیم سوال کنیم که آیا این داستان تهش خوشحال کننده است یا نه. اگر جواب بله باشه ما یک ژانری رو داریم که تو ادبیات یا تو سینما ژانر کامیکه و اگر جواب ما اینجا نباشه ما یک در واقع وضعیت تراژیک رو داریم. در صورتی که ما برگردیم به بالا ما از خودمون سوال کنیم که آیا آنتاگونیست قصدش اینه که یک آسیبی به پروتاگونیست یا قهرمان داستان بزنه؟ اگه جواب بله باشه ما میتونیم از خودمون سوال کنیم که آیا اون شخصیت منفی هیچ وقت میتونه متقاعد بشه که به مشکل قهرمان کمک کنه؟ اگه جواب نباشه ما میتونیم این سوال بعدی رو مطرح کنیم که در نهایتاً آیا در مورد وضعیت آنتاگونیست ما اهمیت میدیم بهش یا نه؟ و اگر جواب نباشه ما باز با این سوال مواجهیم که آیا پایان خوشحال کننده است یا نه؟ که اگر جواب بله باشه یک وضعیت رمانتیک رو داریم، اگر جواب نباشه یک وضعیت هجوگونه رو داریم. این رو من میخوام خواهش کنم پژوهشگرایی که اینجا هستن بعداً اگر به دقت راجع به این الگو فکر کنن، ما میتونیم توی مناقشه این همین الگو رو ببینیم. یعنی مثلا اگر این رو شما سوار کنید الان یا اپلای کنید تو وضعیت مثلا روسیه و اوکراین، میتونید اینجا روایت روس‌ها رو از اوکراینی‌ها به عنوان کسایی که نازی ان و اونجا دارن برخلاف امنیت روسیه عمل میکنن توی این قرار بدید، یا روایت اوکراینی‌ها از روس‌ها رو که مثلا روس‌ها اونجا آدم بدها هستن، اوکراینی‌ها قهرمان‌ها هستن، و عین همین وضعیت رو ما میتونیم در مورد در واقع مناقشه روسیه و اوکراین الان تحلیل کنیم. همینطور ما میتونیم از این برای تحلیل وضعیت مناقشه‌ای که بین ایران و آمریکا سالها وجود داشته استفاده کنیم. آقای دکتر سیمونز اشاره کردن که ما توی مناقشه معمولا شخصیت‌هایی داریم که توی ژانر توی ادبیات و سینما بهشون میگن فلکت کاراکتر، یعنی همون شخصیت‌های سفید و سیاه. یعنی وقتی که مناقشه‌ای درست میشه، ما دیگه آدم‌های در واقع تو اون طیف وسط نداریم. کسایی رو داریم که تقسیم میشن به یا کسایی که خیلی خوبن یا کسایی که خیلی بدن و فرشته و دیوسازی میشه از شخصیت‌ها. توی ادبیات هم ما همین رو داریم. من میرسم به الگویی که خود ایشون معرفی کردن. ایشون در واقع مبدع یا نظریه پرداز نظریه روت نراتیو تئوری هستن که من نمیدونم چقدر ترجمه خوبیه، ولی چیزی که به ذهنم رسید این بود که نظریه روایت ریشه‌ای اسمش رو بذارم. ایشون از آقای مکس وبر این نظریه رو کمک میکنن برای توسعهش و میگن که مکس وبر معتقد بود که ما تو بحث قدرت اجتماعی توی 3 حوزه میتونیم صحبت کنیم. یکی در حوزه در واقع طبقه، دومی در حوزه وضعیت اجتماعی و سومی در مورد گروه، که تو حوزه مثلا گروه ما نظام‌های سیاسی داریم و به ارتش‌ها رو داریم. در مورد وضعیت اجتماعی ما ریس رو داریم یا نژاد رو داریم و جنسیت رو داریم و سکشوالیتی یا گرایش‌های جنسی رو داریم. همینطور در مورد طبقه هم ما با سرمایه در واقع بازار سرمایه با بازار مصرف و با بازار کار مواجه هستیم. ایشون میاد از این بحث آقای وبر استفاده میکنه برای اینکه نظریه خودش رو درست کنه که به نظر من خیلی جالب بود و خیلی هم ما میتونیم قشنگ این رو توی مسائلی که امروز تو جامعه ایران داریم به نظرم استفاده کنیم برای توضیحش. ایشون فرمودن که ما 4 دغدغه اساسی داریم یا 4 ارزش اساسی داریم که این ارزش‌ها یکی ارزش امنیته، 2 ارزش شأن و جایگاه انسانیه، 3 بحث ثروت یا توزیع عادلانه ثروت شد و 4 موضوع آزادیه که در مقابلش استبداد قرار میگیره. ایشون از این الگو استفاده میکنن برای اینکه توضیح بدن که چطور تو آمریکا این 4 ارزش میاد ازش بهره برداری میشه برای اینکه داستان سازی یا روایت سازی بشه برای در واقع پیشبرد سیاست ها. مثلا آقای جورج بوش تو بحث سپتامبر 11 یا 11 سپتامبر اومد از بحث سکیوریتی که اینجاییه که در واقع زرد رنگ بالا گوشه سمت راست استفاده کرد برای اینکه بگه که خب ما یک قهرمان داریم و یک آدم بد داریم. قهرمان اینجا رئیس جمهور آمریکاست که در واقع در مقابل آدم بدها ایستاده. آدم بدها کسایی هستند که ارزش امنیت رو به خطر انداختن، در مقابل در واقع ارزش‌های دیگه این ارزش رو خیلی بالا میاره آقای بوش و کابینه‌شون و میگه که ما می‌خوایم از این ارزش دفاع کنیم. مثال دیگه ایشون در مورد یکی از شاهان انگلستان بود که ایشون گفتن که اینجا بحث الان حاکمیت قانون و بحث در واقع یک حاکمیه که با استبداد خودش این ارزش رو به خطر انداختن. و تو قسمت پایین بحث قسمت آبی رنگ ما می‌بینیم که تو فارسی ما کلمه خیلی جالبی براش داریم تو سالهای اخیر تو ترمینولوژیامون، اونم آقازاده ها هستن. آقازاده ها در واقع موجودات انگلی که اینها میان و سوار جامعه میشن، از منابع ثروت استفاده میکنن و مانع از این میشن که ثروت به شکل عادلانه توزیع بشه. تو آمریکا این در واقع شرکت هایی هستن که میان همین کار رو انجام میدن و به عنوان الیت های اقتصادی دست اندازی میکنن به این ارزشی که ارزش عدالت هست. و 4 در واقع وضعیت اجتماعی افراده که ما میبینیم که گروه‌هایی مثل گروه‌های زنان، مثل گروه‌های اقلیت‌ها، اینها در معرض تهاجم هستن توسط معمولا کسایی که قدرت دارن یا دولت‌ها و این ارزش اساسی این برابری اجتماعی اینجا زیر سوال میره در واقع. و بر اساس این 4 تا ارزش ما می‌بینیم که یک قهرمان داریم و یک قربانی داریم که اینجا ایشون در مورد قربانی‌ها بیشتر صحبت کردن. قربانی‌ها توی بحث امنیتی شهروندان بیگناه هستن که مورد هجوم قرار میگیرن طبق روایت از طرف وحشی‌ها یا ویلن‌ها. توی این بخش پایین‌تر از نظر ایشون ما شهروندان عاقلی قربانی هستن که یک پادشاه ستمگر داره ارزش آزادی اینها رو با زیر پا گذاشتن قانون در واقع به چالش میکشه. اینجا قربانی‌ها مردمان بیگناهی هستن که آزادی برابریشون در واقع به چالش کشیده شده و در قسمت آخر قربانی‌ها در واقع شهروندان بیگناهی هستن که معمولاً عضو گروه‌های اقلیت هستن یا اینا خیلی بی‌دفاع هستن و شأن و منزلت اجتماعی اینها به چالش کشیده میشه. ایشون بعدش در مورد در واقع نحوه در واقع اندازه‌گیری این و تلفیق‌های دیگه که ما میتونیم در واقع 12 تا تلفیق مختلف از ترکیب و اینها ما میتونیم داشته باشیم و در مورد اینها توی نظریه رود نراتیوش صحبت کرد و مثال‌هایی از در واقع کیس‌های آورد که توی کشورهای مختلف الان قابل صحبت هستن در مورد این نظریه ایشون توی در واقع بخش چت هم یه دونه لینکی رو گذاشتن که با استفاده از این لینک شما میتونید برید سوالهایی که گذاشتن رو جواب بدید. من در مورد سوالاتشون یک سوالی در واقع از ایشون دارم، چون سوالاتشون بیشتر توی بستر جامعه آمریکا قابل فهمه و مسائل جامعه آمریکا، ولی در هر حال جالبه بعد از اینکه شما این رو پر کردید به شما میگه که شخصیت شما از نظر این 4 تا ارزش و رود نراتیو تیوری توی کدومی که از طبقه بندی ها قرار میگیره. این هم مثال هایی بود که ایشون از کیس اریتره زد و گفتن که چطور میشه از رود نراتیو استفاده کرد برای توضیح روایت های قالبی که یا روایت های ریشه‌ای که توی مناقشه وجود داره. من میخوام اجازه بگیرم به زبان انگلیسی برگردم و سوالات شما رو مطرح کنم. آقای دکتر نظری سوال پرسیدن، اگر سوال دیگه دارید لطفاً توی بخش چت بنویسید و این جلسه رو صرفاً به عنوان یک جلسه آشنایی با بحث نراتیو یا روایت و نقشش در روانشناسی سیاسی به ویژه توی بحث مناقشه در نظر بگیرید. اگر علاقمند بودید میتونید در واقع با من یا با دوستای دیگه عزیزای دیگه آقای دکتر نظری و عزیزان دیگه که تو حوزه روانشناسی سیاسی کار میکنن تماس بگیرید برای اینکه منابع بیشتر رو بهتون معرفی کنیم. خب آقای دکتر نظری سوالشون رو من اول به فارسی بگم. آقای دکتر نظری امکان داره سوالتون رو به فارسی بفرمایید که بعد من انگلیسیشو برای آقای دکتر سیمونز بپرسم؟ خب من نمیدونم ایشون تونستن به بخش میکروفون دسترسی پیدا کنن یا نه. Let me switch to English. So, Dr. Simmons, one of the questions is, first I want to ask a very general question and then I want to get to Dr. Nazari's question. He's one of the board members of the IPSA Political Psychology Committee and one of our colleagues in University of Tehran. And he has a very interesting question. But before that, I want to ask a very general question. The general question is, so when I think about the case of US-Iran conflict, because it's relevant, interesting for people in Iran, I can see that your theory, root narrative theory, and in general narrative can explain a lot of things. When we think about flat characters, we can see that we have axis of evil and great Satan, which are some of the reflections of flat character in the narrative of US-Iran conflict. We can find a lot of other interesting points from your root narrative when we talk about 4 values: security, dignity, equality, and liberty in today's heated debates in Iran. All of them. We have villains and heroes. So the question is, do you believe that root narrative theory can be a universal theory? And if so, what are some of the nuances when we think about context? And when I talk about context, I mean in general, maybe socio-political, economic context, international, even maybe geographic context, and specifically culture. What do you think about this?
Thank you so much for that wonderful question. I think that's the most important question. The first thing I would say is that I'm gratified to hear that you see these four values working and play in Iran. I suspected they would be, and it's good to know that you see them there. I think that the first step would be, yes, to realize that we're dealing with flat character types. That's just the nature of the game. But to then recognize that politicians, we can't simply ignore that flat characters drive politics, but we can then try to understand what kinds of flat characters the other side is using. So as you saw with my case of Eritrea, it would be interesting to look at Iranian policy debate, US policy debate about the same issue, perhaps the nuclear issue, to look at that debate and then root narrative map it, show how these different perspectives are being represented. Is there a root narrative structure gap there? And I don't know. I suspect there probably is. And if there is, then we should educate policymakers, let's say Anthony Blinken's team in the United States, to see that this is the kind of root narrative profile, which means the moral attitude of your Iranian interlocutors. This is how they see the world and how they would like to approach it. And in other words, they see a duck, you see a rabbit. And to begin there, that would be the first thing I'd want to do. The second and more complicated thing, because I think that policymakers, and this is true of the Iranians as well, very rational, very systematic, and they'd want to take values out of the equation. But in fact, you can't, because politics is run by values and morality. You can't do that. The people are moved by that. They're not moved by policy commitments and respecting our promises. So I think the first step would be to generate empathy among policymakers, just to represent this is the gap you're engaged in. The more complicated thing would be to respect the specific cultural symbols that are developed in these stories. So I don't know how the 9/11 imagery of the Twin Towers feels in Iran, but it feels very strong still in the United States. Yeah. So it might even be a positive thing. Who's to say? But to generate that kind of sympathy and empathy, really, a recognition of those particular symbols, even if there is no root narrative gap. So the first step would be to investigate to see if there are root narrative gaps, and to realize that when we engage the conflict, we're seeing those things through that lens. The Eritrean case is very important. So Iran is a strong country, Eritrea is not. Okay, so when you have what's considered to be a bad country who's a weak country, what do? You bully that country, right? Because they what can they do, you know? And so Iran, you can't bully so easy. It's a very strong country, but still there's this tension. So the question would be, when lawmakers engage in Eritrea, I think they don't have the incentive to rethink. Maybe this is really a duck and I hadn't thought it through and so on. But with Iran, perhaps there's the hope, because as much as you might want to, each side would like to bully the other, we've been stuck since '79 in many respects in this entrenched conflict, which does neither side any good. So I think that would be an interesting, I don't think it'll solve the problem, but I suspect root narrative theory will work very well in Iran. I suspect it would be interesting to discover what the root narrative profiles of its influential leaders are, and to have a conversation about a particular event, say, as a domain of activity, and then to see how it was that the American lawmakers and policymakers, and remember, it's not always the president, it's someone down in the State Department who's making the decision, someone who's in the Defense Department, to show them that they, in fact, are taking these lenses on. It's almost like this. You take this, oh, I see. You put your glasses on and now you see a different world. That would at least start the beginning of an empathetic conversation, perhaps. That's an interesting potential use.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. So let's get to Dr. Nazari's question. He asks that many of these conflicts, for instance, think about the case of US-Iran and Iran as the axis of evil, flat character. many of these conflicts are made and created by states. They are not coming from culture or identity or deep problems between nations. So what do you think about these aspects, that narratives and conflicts are created and made by states?
I think that's right. I think not only states, but I would say by powerful actors, various different powerful actors. So state leaders are among the most powerful, but businesses can be very effective in public relations, especially if they someone like Google or Meta can be very powerful in structuring conversations with the proper investments. Think of British Petroleum, right? That is, it's related to the state, but it's independent of the state. But there are other actors. So what I would say is this: the problem is that the people are not inherently, how should I put this? People, the normal people are susceptible to flat characterizations by, I think, their very psychology, which is why movies sell very well, why politics tends to play the way it does. And certain elites have the potential to take culture and shape it, especially when there's no contact. So, for example, I would far prefer to be in Tehran today giving this talk, but it would be very difficult to do, right? So that's a limit that we face. So how do we then address that? So that's part of the challenge, I would say, is that yes, elites do drive these conversations, but we need to respect the influence of flat characterization in politics before we can move towards those rounder characterizations. That's my sense of it. Is that I think people are open to the roundness, but they need to be presented. Maybe this is the answer. I think that people are open to round understandings of the other, but they have to be given a very powerful version of it. And always the bad money drives out the good. That is to say, the flat character tends to take the round character and get rid of it, and win at the box office or win at the polling booth. That's the challenge we face, is to tell interesting stories about peace.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. So one of the questions is about, one of the big questions here is about data collection and analysis in root narrative theory. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point. There's no specific methodology attached. So what I did with the Eritrea case and the United States case, I'm sorry, I have a little background noise, is I tried to pick important examples that were everyone would agree are important. So if you want to know how the Republican Party of the United States works, the platform is a very good place to look. If you're interested in Eritrea, President Isaias Afwerki is the person you need to pay attention to, and Martyrs' Day speech is when he's going to tell his most important stories about the country and the nation of Eritrea. So you need an insider who can tell you, when this person speaks in this occasion, that matters. That's what you would need. So that the qualitative aspect in that respect is very easy. That's why I say it's like DNA. All you need to show me is the coffee cup, and now I can tell you. You see, so it's very powerful. And so because it's hidden in plain sight. That's why I use the coffee cup metaphor, because no one is intending to reveal the root narrative profile. They can't help but do it because they're telling a story that they want their audience to listen to, and they want to emotionally move that audience. So it's available very readily. And so therefore data collection in that respect is not hard at all. It's a matter of making an argument that these are important data. They're not. The quantitative side is more interesting, which is why I developed the instrument, which is still quite new, and that I made available in the chat and could do through another means if necessary. And we had a question of whether it's culturally and linguistically appropriate or not for Iran, but I don't know. But that would be a different set of techniques. You could look at a population, you could sample them, you could discover what the root narrative profile is, and then you could adjust what you're doing accordingly. So it's a quantitative tool that could be used like any other scaling instrument of psychometrics. It's a fairly it ought to be familiar to psychologists.
Right. Thanks. So with the emergence and growth of social media, powerful actors do not have monopoly over dominant narratives. Is that true? And what's the impact of social media on narratives and dominant narratives?
Yes, it is true. The nice thing is that we no longer just speak one direction, we speak two directions. Oddly enough, I think that because of the management of algorithms, it might be empowering dominant actors even more than we would think. That is maybe more than we had before, but even worse because it gets into our daily lives in a more organic way. So because the algorithm drives the attention, I think we may be having even flatter character types being represented than we did before social media. This is simply an opinion. But it seems to me that although social media empowers alternative voices, the powerful voices can always adapt and react and then use the social media to their advantage with bots, with technology, with their own drive, with their own AI, which is why artificial intelligence has become the new battleground. Because if you can, interestingly enough, I mean, I'll speak of my own country, the news in this country has gotten worse. The polarization in representation has gotten worse, not better in the era of social media. We are less open in some ways to alternative points of view than we were before social media. So if that's true in the United States, perhaps it's true elsewhere too. So in many respects, I'm hopeful that social media is a vehicle for change, but also worried about it in the way in which it flattens discourse rather than rounding it in the way we might hope.
Right. Thank you so much. And the last question, because we are running a little bit out of time, and the last question is, how can we apply narratives in general and root narrative to not only resolve the US-Iran conflict, but to make a friendly relationship and peace between the two nations?
Well, very good question and a nice place to end. This is really why I'm here today. I'm interested in this project. As I say, going back to an earlier answer, I think it's important for policymakers on both sides to realize they're not being rational actors all the time. That is, they are very smart, they're very clever, they know the situation very well, but they do have a duck lens or a rabbit lens they bring to the problem, and they can't help it. It's human nature that we act in that way. If we could produce some awareness among our policy elites about, those people who are influential, maybe no longer in office, maybe they're not, maybe they were in office and they have influence, what we call track two diplomacy, to have some kind of track two diplomacy which helped people to recognize the way they misunderstand one another, even when they look at the same reality. I think that would be really interesting, because I think that smart people don't want to think they're being deluded, but they don't want to think they're telling a narrative, a story. They want, I'm doing an analysis. But I think we can't help but be, the story tells us as much as we tell the story. And root narrative might help to demonstrate that.
Wow. Very interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons. I really appreciate your presentation. It was amazing. And thank you so much, our audience in Iran and elsewhere. Hope everybody has a wonderful day and night in Iran. It's time to say goodbye. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure.